Did you know that some executions were never meant to be witnessed? Not because they were secret, but because they were designed to feel like nothing had happened at all. There were no crowds, no announcements, no final words recorded for history to remember. In some systems, people were not executed, they were processed. Their names remained in files, their cases stayed technically open, and on paper they never died. They simply stopped appearing. For decades, this method left almost no records, not because the records were destroyed, but because they were never written in the first place. And the most unsettling part? Most of the people involved believed they were doing nothing wrong, because silence, when repeated long enough, begins to feel normal. Tonight, we're exploring the execution method so quiet it disappeared people without ever admitting it had. This is NOXHOUR. Long before anyone understood what was happening, before the paperwork thinned and the names began to vanish, there was only a feeling that something about the place was wrong. Not visibly wrong, not in any way that could be pointed to or reported, but wrong in the way air feels heavy before a storm that never arrives, in the way footsteps seem too loud in a building that was never meant to echo. People who worked there would later say there was nothing unusual about their days, that the halls were clean, the procedures ordinary, the rules clearly posted and rarely broken. Yet almost all of them would struggle to explain why they avoided certain corridors, or why they hesitated before opening certain doors, or why, when asked about specific individuals, they felt an inexplicable pressure in their chest, as if the question itself had crossed some invisible boundary. No alarms ever sounded in those places. No emergency lights flashed. Nothing dramatic ever occurred. And that was the first warning sign, though no one recognized it as such at the time. The system that perfected the quiet execution did not begin with cruelty, at least not openly. It began with inconvenience, with officials frustrated by protests, by journalists asking too many questions, by records that refused to stay buried, by the simple, persistent fact that loud deaths created problems long after the bodies were gone. Every public execution, every visible punishment, generated a ripple that could not be fully controlled, because once a death was witnessed, it no longer belonged entirely to the authority that carried it out. It belonged to memory, and memory has a way of resurfacing when it is least welcome. So the system adapted, not violently, not abruptly, but methodically, the way bureaucracies always do, shaving away excess, smoothing out inefficiencies, removing unnecessary steps until only the quietest, least noticeable version of the process remained. Executions were moved indoors, then further indoors, then into rooms that no longer resembled places of punishment at all, but spaces that looked medical, administrative, neutral, rooms designed not to provoke fear, but compliance, because fear makes noise and compliance does not. The condemned were no longer dragged or restrained or publicly condemned. Instead, they were informed of evaluations, assessments, transfers, procedures that suggested continuity rather than finality. And because humans are conditioned to follow processes that appear incomplete, they walked willingly into rooms where nothing about the environment suggested death was imminent. There were no executioners waiting inside, no masked figures, no tools that could later be described with certainty.
There were only staff members performing narrow tasks, each of them responsible for something so small and so procedural that on its own it could never be considered lethal. One person monitored breathing, another adjusted dosage, another documented vitals, another signed off on transport. No one ever witnessed the entire sequence, and that, more than anything else, was the design's greatest strength, because without a complete sequence, there could be no complete understanding, and without understanding, there could be no accusation. Death itself was engineered to arrive without ceremony, without resistance, without a precise moment that could later be identified as the end. Instead, it arrived gradually, disguised as fatigue, as sedation, as failure, as the quiet shutting down of systems that had been gently encouraged to stop cooperating. If someone were to look at the charts afterward, they would see fluctuations, anomalies, a body that simply failed in a way bodies sometimes do, especially under stress, especially in custody, especially in places where oversight was limited and explanations were flexible. And explanations were always available. They were printed on forms, spoken in rehearsed tones, written into reports that never quite said what happened, only what did not happen, carefully avoiding any language that might suggest intention, responsibility, or finality. In many cases, there was no death certificate at all. The individual was not declared deceased because declaring death creates a record, and records have a way of surviving longer than intended. Instead, the individual was marked as transferred, a word chosen not for its accuracy, but for its ambiguity, because transferred implies motion, possibility, somewhere else, and somewhere else is difficult to verify. Families received notices that sounded official enough to discourage further inquiry, notices that cited regulations, security concerns, privacy laws, phrases that closed doors without appearing to do so. And when families pressed for details, they encountered delays, reassurances, requests to be patient, until patience turned into exhaustion, and exhaustion turned into silence. Silence was never enforced, it was cultivated. Inside the facilities, the architecture itself became part of the method, though few would have described it that way. Walls were thicker than necessary. Doors closed without sharp sounds. Ventilation systems produced a constant low hum that masked anything unexpected. And floors were constructed to absorb impact rather than reflect it, ensuring that even accidents would leave no audible trace. Staff members noticed patterns but could never quite articulate them, because articulation requires comparison, and comparison requires records, and the records never aligned cleanly enough to support suspicion. People would be present one day and absent the next. Files would stop updating, schedules would quietly change, and the system would continue functioning without disruption, which, in an environment that valued efficiency above all else, was interpreted not as a warning, but as success. Over time, the method ceased to feel like a method at all. It became routine. New employees were trained without context, taught procedures without history, instructed in compliance without explanation, and because no one ever labeled the process an execution, no one felt they were participating in one. They were simply doing their jobs, following protocols designed by someone else, protocols that had already passed inspection, already been approved, already been normalized. Language protected everyone involved. Medical language, administrative language, neutral language. Words that smoothed over consequences and replaced moral weight with process flow, until death itself became just another outcome to be managed, another variable to be resolved quietly and efficiently. Years passed, then decades, and by the time historians began noticing inconsistencies, the trail was already too cold, the gaps too numerous, the documentation too fragmented to reconstruct with certainty. Because you cannot prove a pattern when the pattern was designed to look like coincidence. Facilities showed unusually high transfer rates. Populations declined without corresponding mortality records. Entire periods existed where numbers simply did not add up. But gaps do not testify, and absence does not scream. And without witnesses, without sound, without spectacle, the quiet execution succeeded in doing what no method before it ever did. It erased, not just people, but the very evidence that they had been erased. Even now, the echoes are subtle, buried beneath official explanations and administrative language, visible only to those who look too closely and ask questions that make others uncomfortable. Because the most unsettling realization is not that such a method existed, but that it never required invention. It only required silence. And silence, once perfected, does not need to be maintained.
What made the method endure was not secrecy in the traditional sense, because secrets demand constant protection and eventually fail under pressure, but something far more resilient: normalization, the gradual reshaping of expectations until the absence of noise felt natural, even comforting, and the presence of questions began to feel intrusive, disruptive, unnecessary. In places where the quiet execution had been refined the longest, silence was no longer noticed at all. It was simply the background state of existence, like the low hum of electricity in walls, or the distant vibration of machinery beneath a city, always present, rarely acknowledged, and deeply unsettling only when it briefly stopped. Staff members came and went over the years, some staying only months, others entire careers, yet none could recall a specific moment when they first became uneasy, because unease did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated, layer by layer, through small inconsistencies that never quite aligned into something solid enough to confront. A person might notice that certain names never appeared twice on schedules, or that some rooms were always cleaned more thoroughly than others, despite appearing unused, or that files associated with particular procedures were always thinner, lighter, less complete, as if documentation itself had learned where not to linger. Those who asked careful questions were not punished. Punishment would have been too loud. Instead, they were redirected, reassigned, encouraged to focus on their specific responsibilities, reminded gently that the system functioned best when everyone trusted the process and avoided unnecessary curiosity, because curiosity, after all, slows things down, and slowing things down was framed as irresponsible. Efficiency was the highest virtue. Efficiency justified everything. It justified the way individuals were isolated before procedures, not for cruelty, but for stability. It justified limiting contact with families, not to conceal, but to reduce agitation. It justified rapid transitions between stages, not to prevent resistance, but to maintain order. Each justification sounded reasonable on its own, and when combined, they formed a structure so rational, so administrative, that questioning it began to feel irrational, emotional, unprofessional. This is how silence becomes self-enforcing, not through fear, but through logic. Over time, even the idea of an execution began to feel outdated, associated with an older, cruder era of governance, an era that relied on force rather than systems, spectacle rather than control, noise rather than certainty. The quiet method did not need to threaten,
It did not need to announce. It simply removed. Those who entered its path rarely understood what was happening until understanding was no longer useful. And even then, the realization arrived without a drama, without a sudden rush of terror, but as a vague sense of finality, like noticing too late that a door has already closed softly behind you. There were no final pleas, because pleas require listeners. There were no last words, because last words must be recorded to matter. There was only compliance, sedation, and the slow narrowing of awareness until even the concept of resistance felt distant, irrelevant, strangely abstract. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Facilities passed inspections, reports were filed, metrics improved. In fact, some facilities were praised for their calmness, their lack of incidents, their remarkable ability to maintain order without force. And those accolades reinforced the method further, embedding it deeper into institutional culture, where it could no longer be separated from normal operations. At a certain point, the method ceased to be something that was used. It became something that was assumed. When a person disappeared, no one asked whether they had died. They asked where they had been transferred. And when no answer came, the absence of an answer itself became the answer. Historians who later attempted to reconstruct these periods encountered an unusual problem, not an absence of data, but an excess of neutral data, endless forms, reports, and logs filled with information that was technically complete, yet emotionally empty, records that described systems functioning perfectly, even as people vanished within them. Statistical anomalies appeared, but interpretation requires context, and context was precisely what had been removed. Each data set existed in isolation, clean and reasonable on its own, meaningless when combined. And so the quiet execution escaped history, not by hiding, but by dissolving into paperwork so thoroughly that it could no longer be distinguished from ordinary administration. This is why it lasted, because no one ever had to decide to continue it. It continued itself. Even when policies changed, even when regimes fell, even when institutions were restructured or renamed, the underlying logic remained intact, migrating smoothly into new frameworks, new terminology, new justifications, always presenting itself as the most efficient solution to an old problem. What do you do with people who disrupt order? You remove them. What do you do when removal creates attention? You remove the attention. What do you do when even absence becomes suspicious? You normalize absence. And so the method evolved, growing quieter, cleaner, more abstract, until it no longer required rooms or equipment or even physical proximity, just processes, approvals, and decisions made far from where consequences were felt. At its most refined stage, the quiet execution did not look like an execution at all. It looked like policy. It looked like delay. It looked like indefinite review. It looked like medical complication, administrative backlog, procedural limbo. It looked like nothing happening. And that was the final achievement. Because nothing happening cannot be protested. Nothing happening cannot be recorded as violence. Nothing happening feels safe, until you realize how much can disappear inside it. And by the time that realization arrives, it usually arrives alone, quietly and without witnesses, in the mind of someone who understands too late that the most dangerous systems are not the ones that shout their power, but the ones that never need to raise their voice.
Eventually, there comes a moment when a system no longer remembers why it began doing something, only that it has always been done this way. And that moment is more dangerous than any deliberate act of cruelty, because intention can be challenged,
but habit rarely is. In the later years of the quiet execution, there were no architects left who understood the full design, no officials who could trace the method back to its origin, only inherited procedures passed down like customs whose meanings had been forgotten, repeated because repetition itself had become proof of legitimacy. When questioned, administrators spoke confidently about compliance and oversight, about layers of review and safeguards that sounded reassuring in isolation, yet none of those layers ever intersected at the point where a person ceased to exist, because that point had been carefully removed from the structure, leaving behind a smooth continuity where nothing appeared to break. This absence of rupture was essential. Deaths that interrupt processes demand explanation. Deaths that dissolve into them do not. People who vanished within these systems were rarely described as gone. Instead, they were described as unresolved, pending, under consideration, words that suspended them in an administrative limbo where neither life nor death needed to be acknowledged, and where waiting quietly became the expected response. Waiting is powerful. Waiting drains urgency. Waiting transforms concern into routine. Families learned to wait. They waited for updates that never arrived, for reviews that never concluded, for decisions perpetually deferred, and as months turned into years, the act of waiting itself became their relationship with the institution, a relationship that required patience rather than protest, endurance rather than outrage. And endurance, like silence, leaves very little trace. Inside the facilities, silence became a professional skill, something cultivated and rewarded, not explicitly, but subtly, through promotions given to those who asked fewer questions, through praise directed at those who kept operations smooth, through gentle marginalization of those who lingered too long over inconsistencies. No one was ever told not to speak. They simply learned when speaking was inefficient. The buildings themselves seemed to age differently from the world outside, sealed off from time by constant lighting and recycled air, places where seasons were irrelevant and days blended together, reinforcing the sense that nothing truly changed here, that processes existed outside ordinary chronology. This timelessness was not accidental. When time loses definition, events lose significance. A death that occurs on no particular day, at no particular hour, within no clearly defined sequence, becomes difficult to remember, even for those who were present, because memory relies on anchors, and all the anchors had been quietly removed. In these environments, the quiet execution did not feel violent, it felt procedural. A person would arrive, be processed, evaluated, documented, and then gradually recede from relevance, their presence replaced by paperwork that continued to circulate long after the individual was gone, creating the illusion of continuity where none existed. Files moved through departments without ever arriving anywhere meaningful. Approvals were granted for people who no longer existed. Reviews were conducted on cases that had already ended. And because the system was still functioning, because documents were still moving, because tasks were still being completed, no alarm was triggered. From the system's perspective, everything was working perfectly. This is the stage where the quiet execution becomes truly invisible, not hidden, but normalized to the point where its outcomes are indistinguishable from ordinary delay, from bureaucratic friction, from the familiar frustrations of any large institution. At this stage, even those who suspect something rarely frame it as execution, because execution implies intention, and intention implies responsibility, and responsibility implies someone could be held accountable. It feels safer to believe the truth is smaller, messier, accidental. It feels safer to believe no one is in control. And the system relies on that belief. Over time, the vocabulary surrounding disappearance grows richer, not poorer, providing endless alternatives to the word death, alternatives that soften reality and diffuse emotional response, allowing conversations to proceed without ever reaching a conclusion. The person is under review. The case is complex. The situation is evolving. There are constraints. Each phrase postpones finality. Each postponement extends silence. And silence, once extended long enough, becomes indistinguishable from forgetting. In later analyses, long after the fact, researchers would attempt to quantify the impact of these methods, constructing models and projections to estimate how many people might have been lost to systems that never acknowledged their loss. But even the most conservative estimates relied on assumptions, and assumptions are easily dismissed when they threaten established narratives. Without bodies, there were no graves. Without graves, there were no ceremonies. And without ceremonies, there was no crime that could be named. This was not a failure of justice, it was a redesign of it. Justice was no longer about punishment or resolution, it was about management, managing risk, managing disruption, managing attention. And people, once reduced to variables within that framework, could be minimized without being destroyed, erased without being killed, removed without ever being acknowledged as removed. This is why the quiet execution did not end when laws changed or oversight increased, because it did not violate laws in any obvious way, nor did it resist oversight. It simply flowed around both, adapting its language and procedures to fit whatever structure surrounded it. Oversight reviewed forms. The forms were impeccable. Auditors inspected facilities. The facilities were calm. Committees requested explanations. Explanations were provided. Everything appeared reasonable. Nothing appeared urgent. And urgency is the enemy of silence. Only occasionally did something disrupt this balance, not a scream or a rebellion, but a moment of recognition in an individual who suddenly understood that what they were witnessing was not delay or disorder, but absence, an absence so carefully maintained that it had become invisible. These moments were rare, and they were lonely, because to articulate them required language that no longer existed within the institution. Words that sounded excessive, emotional, outdated, and those who attempted to use them found themselves gently corrected, reminded of procedures, assured that the system was functioning as intended. And perhaps it was, because intention, by this stage, no longer mattered. The quiet execution had become autonomous. It no longer needed to be ordered, it no longer needed to be justified. It simply occurred wherever silence was valued more than truth, wherever efficiency outweighed empathy, wherever the absence of noise was mistaken for the presence of peace. And that is how it survived, not as an act of violence, but as a condition.
There comes a point when silence stops feeling like the absence of sound and begins to feel like the presence of something else. Something heavier, something that presses inward rather than outward, something that fills space so completely that noise itself would feel like a disruption, an intrusion into a carefully balanced stillness. In places shaped by the quiet execution, this stillness became the defining feature, not something imposed, but something expected. An atmosphere that settled over corridors and offices alike, teaching everyone who entered how to move, how to speak, how to think, without ever issuing a command.
People learned to lower their voices instinctively, even in rooms where no one had ever raised theirs, learned to close doors gently, learned to finish conversations quickly, because lingering felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, as if time itself had been rationed and excess attention might draw notice. This was not fear in the traditional sense. Fear is sharp. This was dull, constant, and deeply internalized. It manifested as caution, as professionalism, as restraint, as the quiet understanding that some things did not need to be explored further, not because they were forbidden, but because they were unnecessary, and unnecessary effort was inefficient. Over time, even the concept of disappearance softened. People were not said to vanish, they were said to resolve. A pace resolved, a file resolved, a situation resolved. Resolution implied order, closure, success. It suggested that something messy had been smoothed out, that complexity had been reduced, that uncertainty had been eliminated. And in a system that valued stability above all else, resolution was celebrated without ever examining what had been lost in the process. Those who remained began to feel the quiet execution not as an event, but as a boundary, an invisible perimeter that defined how far thought itself was allowed to travel, beyond which questions became abstract, impractical, vaguely inappropriate. Within that boundary, everything made sense. Procedures aligned, reports matched expectations, outcomes were predictable. Beyond it, there was only speculation, and speculation was discouraged, not through punishment, but through disinterest. Speculation did not advance careers, speculation did not improve metrics, speculation did not resolve anything, so it faded. And as it faded, so did the last traces of resistance, because resistance requires belief in an alternative, and alternatives are difficult to imagine when absence has been normalized for so long that it feels like part of the natural order. This is how the quiet execution achieved its final form, not as a hidden practice, but as an assumption that some people would simply stop being present, that their stories would end without punctuation, that their lives would taper off into administrative quiet rather than dramatic conclusion. The system did not mourn them. Mourning is disruptive. Mourning invites memory, and memory invites return. Instead, the system adjusted, workloads redistributed, schedules updated, processes continued, nothing halted, nothing paused. The absence was absorbed seamlessly, like a soundproof room swallowing a shout that never reaches the outside world. In time, even the idea of accountability lost its shape. Accountability requires a moment of decision, a clear action that can be pointed to and judged. But the quiet execution offered no such moment, only a series of reasonable steps, each justified, each documented, each defensible, none of them fatal on their own. Responsibility dissolved into collaboration, guilt dissolved into routine, and routine, repeated long enough, becomes invisible. For those caught within the method, awareness often came too late to matter, arriving not as panic, but as a gradual realization that the future had quietly closed, that there would be no next stage, no transfer, no review that led anywhere, only continued waiting until waiting itself ceased to have meaning. There was no final injustice to protest, only the slow understanding that nothing was coming, and even that understanding faded, as sedation, isolation, and exhaustion blurred the edges of thought, leaving behind a calm that looked disturbingly like acceptance. From the outside, this calm was interpreted as cooperation. From the inside, it was something else entirely. but there were no words left to describe it. Language had already been stripped away. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the quiet execution was not that it killed without noise, but that it taught everyone around it to mistake silence for peace, to confuse the absence of disruption with the presence of order, to believe that a system without visible violence must be a just one. That belief persists. It persists because it is comforting, because it allows people to trust what they cannot see, because it assures them that if something truly were wrong, they would hear it. But silence is not proof of safety. Silence is often the condition that allows the most permanent forms of harm to settle in and remain undisturbed. The quiet execution did not need secrecy. It needed agreement. Agreement that efficiency mattered more than understanding. Agreement that stability mattered more than truth. Agreement that what could not be heard did not need to be addressed. Once that agreement was in place, the rest followed naturally. Names stopped being spoken. Questions stopped being asked. Records stopped being complete. And somewhere along the way, the line between disappearance and acceptance blurred so completely that it could no longer be found. What remains now is not evidence, not proof, not even accusation, but a pattern of absences, a series of empty spaces where something should be, spaces so carefully maintained that they appear intentional, deliberate, almost peaceful. But peace that requires silence is fragile, and silence, once broken, never fully returns to what it was before. That is why the quiet execution is so difficult to confront, because to confront it, one must first admit that silence itself can be engineered, maintained, and weaponized, not through force, but through patience, procedure, and the slow erosion of attention. And once that admission is made, it becomes impossible not to wonder where else such silence exists, what other absences have been accepted without question, what other processes continue smoothly precisely because no one is listening closely enough to hear what is missing. That realization does not arrive loudly. It does not demand immediate action. It settles quietly, like everything else in this story, lingering long after the words have ended, long after the sound has faded, leaving behind an unease that has no clear source and no obvious resolution. Only the sense that something important has been removed, and no record was ever made.
There is a strange moment that arrives after a long silence, when the mind stops waiting for sound and instead begins listening to the silence itself, as if it might speak, as if it might reveal something that noise never could. And it is in that moment that the quiet execution completes its final transformation, no longer something that happens to others, but something that exists as a condition, a background assumption, a shape the world quietly conforms to. By now there are no rooms to describe, no procedures left to outline, no officials to name, because the method has shed all visible structure and settled into something far more durable, a way of organizing absence so thoroughly that it feels natural, expected, even necessary, like an unspoken rule everyone follows without remembering when they agreed to it. What remains are habits. Habits of not asking, habits of not noticing, habits of filling gaps with reassurance instead of curiosity. These habits do not feel imposed, they feel learned. Learned through repetition, through experience, through countless small moments when attention drifted away from something unresolved and found something easier to focus on instead. Over time, the unresolved stopped demanding attention at all.
It simply waited. The quiet execution never needed belief. It needed participation. Participation through compliance, through patience, through the decision made again and again to accept delay as explanation, process as purpose, and silence as confirmation that nothing was wrong. Once enough people made those decisions, the system no longer required effort to sustain itself. It became self-reinforcing. Silence justified silence. Absence explained absence. And any attempt to disrupt this balance felt strangely uncomfortable, not because it threatened authority, but because it threatened normalcy. The carefully maintained sense that things were under control precisely because nothing appeared to be happening. This is why the quiet execution is so difficult to locate. It does not live in documents. It does not reside in buildings. It exists in expectations, in what people assume will happen when they wait long enough, in what they assume will not happen if no one makes noise. And once those expectations settle, once they become instinctive, the method no longer needs to act. It only needs to be present, listening, waiting. There are still places where people enter systems and never formally leave them, where explanations stretch thin over years, where records remain technically open but functionally dead, where lives fade into procedural limbo so gradually that no single moment can be named as the end. These places rarely draw attention. They rarely need to, because attention requires contrast, and the quiet execution eliminates contrast by making disappearance look exactly like delay, like backlog, like ordinary administrative friction. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, nothing worth raising your voice over. And so voices remain low, lower than necessary, lower than safe. Eventually, even the idea of speaking up begins to feel unnecessary, even rude, as if raising concern would only disturb a system that appears calm, efficient, and orderly on the surface. But calm is not the same as just. Efficiency is not the same as care. Order is not the same as safety. Those distinctions blur in silence, and once blurred, they are difficult to separate again. What lingers after all of this is not fear, not outrage, not even anger, but something far quieter and far more persistent, a subtle awareness that some stories never end because they are never acknowledged as stories at all, only as background conditions, as the way things are. The quiet execution does not announce itself when it is happening. It announces itself only afterward, in hindsight, when absence has accumulated long enough to be noticed, when patterns emerge too late to interrupt, when silence has already done its work. And even then, it does not speak. It waits. It waits for attention to drift again, for questions to soften, for concern to fade, because it understands something fundamental, that silence is not empty. Silence is patient. Silence remembers. Silence listens. And if you listen closely enough, long after the sound has faded and the story appears to have ended, you may begin to notice something unsettling, not a voice, not a sound, but a presence, a sense that the quiet itself is aware of being heard, that it is waiting to see whether you will fill it with noise or leave it exactly as it is.
And now, as the story quiets, there is nothing left to explain. No final document to uncover. No missing page suddenly found. no voice stepping forward to confirm what you already suspect. Only the silence remains. Not the kind that follows noise, but the kind that was always there, waiting beneath it, patient, undisturbed, unchanged by time or attention. This is where most records end, not with conclusions, but with absence, because the systems that erase do not announce themselves. They do not leave signatures. They do not mark endings. They simply stop responding. If you feel unsettled, it is not because something frightening was revealed, but because something familiar was stripped away. The comfort of knowing where a story begins and where it is allowed to end. At NOXHOUR, we tell stories that were never meant to be remembered. Stories buried under procedure, under routine, under silence. Some of what you hear may be documented, some may be disputed, and some exists only in the spaces where records should have been. That uncertainty is intentional, because history is not always written by those who survived. Sometimes it is shaped by what was never recorded at all. If you are still listening, it means the quiet did not push you away. It means you noticed it. And once noticed, it is difficult to unhear. There is no call to action here, no instruction, no request, only a reminder that silence is never empty, that absence is never neutral, and that some stories do not end, they simply wait. This has been NOXHOUR, where history whispers and the quiet listens back.